fellow activists, comrades and friends, respected members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My voice carries the echoes of the many nations on our continent who have waged a bitter struggle against colonization. We paid a heavy price, but we remained strong in the conviction that the end of occupation is inevitable, the end of colonization is inevitable, and that justice will always prevail. Today, I call on the people of Sheffield and all in the UK and Ireland to support our call for dismantling apartheid from South Africa to Palestine. I echo the voice of Alauda Equino, nearly 250 years ago, who addressed the people of Sheffield from Thomas Bryant New Methodist Chapel on Scotland Street, calling for the abolition of the slave trade. Our message tonight is as clear as his was way back in 1790. Freedom is inevitable, and the occupation of Palestine must and will end. The genocide in Gaza and all occupied Palestine must and will end. We will not cow down, even in the face of relentless bombardment and brutality. The numbers belie the actual scale of the trauma inflicted on innocent civilians in Gaza. Somehow, it escapes Netanyahu and his criminal war cabinet that killing more Palestinians will not make the case of apartheid Israel more just. On the contrary, every life taken accelerates the inevitable march to freedom. Comrades and friends, ladies and gentlemen, the Zionist project is failing since they stand exposed in the face of global public opinion. Apartheid South Africa also acted with such impunity and thought that it was above the law. I have been criticized for statements that I have made in support of the Palestinians and the Palestinian resistance and its various formations. We in South Africa had to learn this bitter lesson that despite the African National Congress, that being the ANC, pursuing passive resistance for decades since its inception in 1906, the South African apartheid regime became increasingly brutal and violent. This led to the adoption of armed struggle in 1962 and the formation of Mkhonto weSizwe, the spear of the nation, with my grandfather, Nelson Mandela, as its first commander-in-chief. Throughout the years of his presidency, starting in 1994 until 2008, President Nelson Mandela was classified as a terrorist, though it did not deter him from speaking the truth and standing for justice and human rights for all. It did not deter him from saying during his visit to Gaza in 1995 that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. Nothing deterred him from proclaiming for all the world to hear that the Palestinian struggle is the greatest moral issue of our time. Comrades and friends, ladies and gentlemen, yesterday, the port of Eilat announced its bankruptcy as a result of loss of trade activities. Sheffield and the anti-apartheid movement in Britain and Ireland were at the forefront of the global boycott and sanctions campaign against apartheid South Africa. We want you to rise to the fore once more as we mobilize the global public support for a comprehensive boycott of apartheid Israel. Let's bring apartheid to its knees again. We repeat our call to the South African government to ban all coal exports to the apartheid Israel. We salute, comrades and friends, our students all over the world who have turned campuses and colleges into sites of struggle and whose courageous efforts have advanced the cause of dismantling apartheid from South Africa to Palestine. You have a very important task in the UK, USA, and all of Europe. We must cut off the line of funding and logistical support that feeds the genocide and that oils the war machine that kills young children, the elderly, and innocent civilians. Already, you have started with some significant victories. Now is not the time to rest. Comrades and friends, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to conclude by saying that I don't know whether I will be able to be with you physically for the remainder of the UK and Ireland trip, or for the Peace and Justice Festival, which will be held by Islam Channel later this month. It seems that there are those who are intent on preventing me from being there physically with you. Rest assured, though, that we stand together today and that we will remain together in our stand of international solidarity until all of occupied Palestine is free. I thank you for the invitation and for being with you this evening. Thank you.
Politicians, they speak highly on the work that you're doing and on Palestine, but unfortunately on the South Africa apartheid anyway, but they haven't been as supportive as they should be for Palestine. So what would you say in terms of those who politicians haven't been coming out and supporting, and at the same time, should we be relying on these politicians when we should be focused more on local organising, grassroots organising, and what lessons can we gain from the South Africa apartheid and how that was dismantled?
Perhaps preface this by a saying from my grandfather in his tour in the United States of America, when he said that any man that changes their position depending on who they are speaking to and the audience they are with can never be trusted and can never lead a people. And therefore, we as South Africans continue to be clear in our message. Wherever there is injustice and oppression, we will always be on the side of the oppressed. The late Archbishop Desmond Tutu said that in the face of oppression, if you choose to be silent, you have already chosen the side of the oppressor. And this comes from two of our Nobel Prize winners.
Thank you.
And therefore, for us, we want to remind the people of Sheffield of who they are and the role they have played throughout history in resisting injustice in their own shores in Sheffield but also in being part of the anti-apartheid movement that brought the most brutal and oppressive regime on the African continent, that being the apartheid regime in South Africa, to its knees. The very same actions you undertook, we are calling on you to implement those actions in support of the Palestinian just cause. As we were able together to collapse apartheid South Africa, let us come together in mobilizing all resources and all people in collapsing apartheid Israel. I thank you.
Thank you very much.
In your talk, you spoke about the boycott movement and its importance to your people in South Africa. I wonder if you can just elaborate on that just a little bit more. Were there particular aspects of the boycott that lifted people's spirits? And if I may, can I also just ask you about the case at the ICJ? That thrilled us, that thrilled the world, and I just wonder how easy was it for your government to organise and take that principled stand for Palestine? So 2 questions in one, thank you.
Well, for us, boycott, divestment and sanctions are an important pillar of struggle. Whilst we were waging an armed struggle against the apartheid regime in South Africa, we also had to rely on the internal resistance to ensure that they exerted pressure on the apartheid government. And this is why it was important in the mid-80s for my grandfather, President Nelson Mandela, to call on young people in particular to render the country ungovernable. But beyond our shores, we had to mobilize South Africans in exile and ensure that every South African in exile was the voice and ambassador of our struggle for liberation. And in this regard, they were able to engage with the international community and crisscross the global community in ensuring that they spread the word about the brutality and the violence that was being meted out on a daily basis against South Africans. And therefore, in the United Kingdom in particular, we were able to witness, many of us in South Africa can never forget the name of Mary Manning, 21-year-old Irish lady who was working a dance store with her colleagues that refused to handle any South African products. And this campaign went global, right across the UK, Europe, and all over the globe. And therefore, we want to call on the global community today and the people of Sheffield and the entire people in the United Kingdom to ensure that you continue to boycott products that are coming from the Zionist entity, as much as you are able to support our boycott campaigns. But we are also have been moved by the dock workers in the United Kingdom that refused to handle any ship that was carrying South African products that were coming into the United Kingdom. And therefore, we call on activists in Sheffield and in the United Kingdom to continue exerting pressure on our comrades in the dock workers to ensure that they inspect every ship and ensure that they are not complicit in participating in handling products and ships that are coming from the Zionist entity. On the second question, in terms of what drove our government, I can make a couple of examples. Before we got to the ICJ, we had to exert pressure on our government to cut ties with the Zionist entity by shutting down the embassy in Tel Aviv. After a long campaign, we were able to reduce that embassy in Tel Aviv into a liaison office. The only embassy we are interested in seeing as South Africans is the one in Ramallah. But we also have made endless calls for the ambassador of the Zionist entity to South Africa to be expelled. And we are happy that they have decided to recall their own ambassador to the Zionist entity. But we have also exerted pressure on the government, particularly the Department of Transport, that was giving traffic permits to the El Al airline, the national carrier of the Zionist entity into South Africa, which we were happy to also see that being cancelled and shut. But also we have South Africans that have been living within the Zionist entity and participating in the genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Since 2014, we have been documenting all those that have participated in the atrocities that are being meted out against the Palestinians on a daily basis. We have over 149 cases that we have submitted to the government through the Ministry of Defense to evoke the Foreign Military Assistance Act, which prohibits any South African from aiding any army outside the borders of the Republic. And in this regard, that has ensured that the government hears the voices of the masses right throughout the landscape of South Africa. And as a government of the people, the ANC-led government, through His Excellency President Ramaphosa, decided to bring the Zionist entity to the ICJ. And we applaud our president and our ministers for this act, because for the first time over the 76 years of the Nakba, the Zionist entity is being held accountable.
Hi Mandla, my name is Javed Siddiqui. It's an honor to be talking to you. You talked about many things, and in particular, I know you mentioned the ICJ, and obviously it is a landmark situation, but the reality is, as you know better than we do perhaps, that the Western governments are completely and totally showing what hypocrisy they're at. So I'd like to comment on that. Another thing that you mentioned was the BDS campaign, and indeed in Sheffield we've been very lucky by going to many, particularly in the area that we're all sitting in, where it happens to be mainly brown and black people, but particularly Muslims are boycotting Coca-Cola, and we constantly get that sort of thing. Finally, you mentioned, and again, I'd like to sort of speak your experiences, particularly Grandad's experiences, but you mentioned the armed struggle, and I think it's very important that we realise that, because the politicians here constantly talk about Israel's right to defend itself. and it's never ever talked about what the right of brown people in that, Lebanon, Palestine. There is a role for resistance in armed struggle, and what you learned from your granddad, we would really benefit from knowing what its role is.
Thank you. I think first and foremost, we must realize that having undergone 350 years of colonialism, coupled with 60 years of a brutal apartheid regime, we came to a time when my grandfather set two choices to us. One, that we can submit to colonization and secular occupation, or we can resist. We chose the latter to resist, and we must today remember that because of those efforts, they have been able to ensure that the right to resist is enshrined in international law. As much as the Western countries can speak about the right for the Zionist entity to defend itself, Palestinians and indigenous societies right across the globe have a right to resist occupation and secular colonialization. And this is important for us to be able to distinguish. In many instances, you find that the settler colonialists are often seen as the victim, where the indigenous societies are then described as terrorists for defending their lands and defending their people. And this exposes the Western hypocrisy. And we will never forget the role of those that stood side by side with us during our darkest days. And we therefore call on you, just as you were able to stand side by side with us, continue to be the voice of the oppressed and most vulnerable throughout the globe. But I must again emphasize the importance of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And in the UK in particular, you rose to the occasion. And we want to call upon you to continue to do what you can in ensuring that the Zionist entity is isolated through boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I thank you.
Do you have anything to say, any advice about how we contest the fact that we are silenced because of the history of the Holocaust?
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you. I think maybe let me highlight the fact that in our own struggle for liberation in South Africa, we had the comrades who were Jewish and served in high-ranking positions within the African National Congress and within my grandfather's armed wing. We have always said that when we speak about the atrocities that are being meted out on a daily basis against Palestinians in general, it has not been from a Jewish background, but a Zionist entity. we have to distinguish that the fight is not against Jews, but against Zionism. And we work closely in South Africa and in the international solidarity community with the Jewish Voice for Palestine and Jews for Palestine, who have mobilized many rabbis right across the globe to speak against the Zionist entity. And they have been known for a strong campaign as Jews to send a clear message to Netanyahu and his war cabinet, not in our name. I thank you.
Good evening and thank you for addressing us this evening. My name is Juliana Samo. I'm African living in Sheffield. Earlier on when you were speaking in response to one of the questions, you said that those who remain silent show which side that they support. So with this in mind, I'm asking you the question, to what extent is the African Union active in supporting and also opposing and challenging the situation in Palestine in relation to the atrocities that's being committed by the Israeli government against the Palestinian people? Or is there a silencing of African opposition and resistance to the situation and the atrocity that's going on in Palestine? So that's what I'd want you to address. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think we must first and foremost not undermine the strength of the Zionist lobby on the African continent. We have seen the Zionist entity utilizing its checkbook diplomacy, dangling a carrot in front of African leaders in particular, in supporting them during election times by manipulating the electronic systems in favor of some leaders that are their allies. But we have also witnessed on the African continent that they will come as the Zionist entity and bring what they usually dangle in front of African leaders to be water desalination technology, which then has been able to get into some African countries. In this regard, we have had to come out with a pushback strategy. South Africa has continuously worked closely with Algeria in particular and Kenya to some extent to mobilize African countries in support of the Palestinian cause. And when we come to the African Union in particular, you would have witnessed that the AU chairperson unanimously gave the Zionist entity an observer status in the AU. It was Algeria and South Africa that rose to the occasion and mobilized the African leaders to reverse that and expel the Zionist entity from the African Union. But we have not also left it to head of states that are able to go and participate at the AU. We are working with grassroots organizations who are in solidarity with Palestine. Like here in South Africa, we have the South African BDS coalition, we have Africa for Palestine. In Kenya, we have the Kenya solidarity with Palestine. And we have been able to mobilize over 21 African grassroots organizations from 21 different countries to come and participate in a solidarity conference in Dakar in March last year, 2023. And these 21 countries and solidarity grassroots movements pledged their support in full for the Palestinian cause. Thank you.
Approximately 12 million girl or female student in Afghanistan, they are not letting to go to school, college, or universities. No one came here to talk for that. One question, so what to do to change these things and remember all the human beings all around the world?
Thank you for the question, and it is a very important question. But I also want to start by saying that it is incorrect to say that no one is talking about it, because you are talking about it. And when you raise the voice, you are already conscientizing myself and many in the room today to add our voices for the girls in Afghanistan. I said in my address that as South Africans, having been able to come from a brutal past of 350 years of colonialism and 60 years of a brutal apartheid regime, we continue to be the voice of the oppressed and most vulnerable, not only on the African continent, as we speak about Western Sahara, the last colony on the occupied, or the last colony on the African continent. But we speak also of Palestine, of Kashmir, and therefore we call upon you. If the Chileans in Sheffield have brought the flag of Chile, if the Cubans have brought the flag of Cuba, you should have brought the flag of Afghanistan this evening and conscientized us and handed out notes about the challenges that girls are experiencing in Afghanistan. Here in South Africa, we have many Nigerians that continue to protest and march in support of the girls in Nigeria that are continuously abducted by Boko Haram. And therefore, we are calling upon you to not shy away. Raise your voice in Sheffield. We therefore want to call on you tonight as you walk out of this hall in Sheffield, be the sole voice of the girls in Afghanistan, so we too can add our voices. I thank you.
Thank you so much for the words of support to the people of Sheffield in relation to the issue of Palestine. Do you believe that we should be putting pressure on the Egyptian government, the Jordanian government, the governments that are surrounding the Zionist state that is preventing food from going into Gaza? Do you believe that we should be going to the embassies and demonstrating outside the embassies and putting pressure on them instead of these countries supplying food to the Zionist state while the people, the women, the children, the old men are starving in Gaza? Thank you very much.
Thank you. You raise an important issue about the countries that are surrounding the Zionist entity. And I have spoken on many platforms on this. that as we waged our struggle for liberation against the apartheid regime in South Africa, the neighboring countries, our frontline states in the SADC region, Lesotho, Swaziland, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, Namibia, Angola, knew very well that if we were to be defeated and our collapse will result in them being the next victims. So we have sent a strong and clear message to the Arab League of Nations and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to not normalize, and they should come in full support of the Palestinian just struggle, just as our frontline states supported our cause. They can learn a lesson from our frontline states. And these were poor nations, unlike the well-resourced countries in the Middle East. We therefore call on the citizenry of these governments to rise to the occasion and to exert pressure. I thank you.
My name is Isaac. And first of all, let me thank you for a very inspirational speech. It was very nice, you know. And my question is really that if the United Nations is impotent in protecting the rights of smaller nations, then what's the future for the small nations if the United Nations is not going to be working for them? And just to take you back to 1936, when Italy invaded Ethiopia under Mussolini, that there was a warning there at that point when it was then the League of Nations from Haile Selassie himself about international security. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
No, thank you. Many of us over the past year have watched the proceedings in the UN General Assembly as well as the Security Council, and have been subjected to witnessing one member state continuously raising its arm to veto any motion which has been supported by over 195 countries, merely and solely because they are protecting their interest and supporting the Zionist entity, is war criminals. For how long are we continuously going to be subjected to Western imperialism and this agenda of settler colonialists? It has been clear to us, particularly as the global South countries, that Western imperialism and its unipolar system is failing. And therefore, we need to exercise our thinking as to what is the alternative. And we have witnessed a shift now into a debate of multipolarity, where we are wanting to see each member state participating equally and speaking as one voice. And in this regard, we in the global South have particularly looked at how we can be able to come together and utilize our numbers in order to ensure that there is a more multipolarity structure that is emerging. And I must say that it is important to heed the call by the Emperor Haile Selassie I'm particularly happy that you mentioned him and Ethiopia in particular, because this is the country that was able to give my grandfather his first passport to be able to travel across the 15 African countries and be able to make his trip to the United Kingdom in 1962 under the name of David Motsamai. And we will therefore continue to heed the call of Emperor Haile Selassie. Thank you.
Hello, I'm one of the student activists. Got a question kind of about how, do you have like any advice for like kind of what we can do, like how we can like step it up in resisting the university's complicity and like involvement in the like research of weapons and like being like an imperial like weapons manufacturer.
Thank you, particularly as students that have added their voice in support of the Palestinian struggle. We have been moved right across the globe as the international solidarity movement in witnessing young people refusing to be complicit through their universities, right across the United States of America, in the UK, and across Europe. And therefore, we continue to call upon young people to be the moral compass of society, and they must add their voice to direct all nations into the future, to leave no stone unturned in looking as to how their universities are complicit, what companies are supporting or are funding the universities and are sharing intellectual property in weaponizing and supporting the Zionist entity. Continue to be the voice of reason and ensure that you add your voice behind the Palestinians. Thank you.
I want to ask you about South Africa post taking apartheid Israel to the International Court of Justice. The West, many politicians in the West, their first reaction to that move by South Africa was a call to impose sanctions on South Africa and South African politicians. Two parts to my very short question. How has the reaction by the United States and its allies impacted life and politics in South Africa, and has it had any influence or effect on South Africa's relationship within some members of the BRICS group? So perhaps you could, if you can, tell us a little bit what sort of pressure South Africa has come under.
Thank you for the question. And perhaps to begin by localizing the pressure that we've experienced, you would start first and foremost within the African National Congress. Many of us as a liberation movement that in every conference that we host as the ANC, we invite many other liberation movements across the SADC region, the African continent, and the global community to come and celebrate our achievements and being the oldest liberation movement globally to date. This has culminated in His Excellency President Ramaphosa, with our ministers, Naledi Pandor and Ronald Lamola, being able to take the Zionist usurping entity to the ICJ and hold it accountable for its genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And in this regard, we knew very well that this stance will bring a lot of pressure, not only to the governing party, but to South Africa in its totality. And we have seen the United States of America coming with frivolous motions, trying within Congress and the Senate to ensure that South Africa was kicked out of AGOA. But we have continued to stand our ground and advocate for our position. You stand united as South Africans to say that as long as there is any nation suffering and living under oppression anywhere in the world, we will continue to be the voice for the oppressed and most vulnerable. I thank you.